Now, with more Australians moving into apartment buildings, many are asking if the nation's high-density housing projects could have been better designed.
And I think we know the answer to that. Going Dutch is part of Melbourne Design Week, and it takes a look at how design lessons from the Netherlands could be very well used here. Koos de Keijzer is the founding partner of DKO Architecture and joins us in the studio. Koos, nice to see you. How are you?
Nice to be here. I'm very well.
And look, we present you this morning as, as a Dutch architect, but listen to that accent. That's an Aussie accent.
29 years in Australia. I'm very pleased I'm here.
And that'll do it for you. What are the lessons? Are there any lessons out of Dutch architecture?
Look, I think there's a rigorous Dutch design thinking that actually looks at a series of options, and I think that's a cultural rigorousness that's actually right throughout Dutch society, and which becomes very topical. And a lot of people in Holland are actually talking about how they live and the standard of housing and what higher densities actually mean.
Now, Koos, I know that a lot of your architecture focuses really on the culture of a place. How would you compare Australia versus the Netherlands? I mean, what can we learn from the Dutch design?
Yeah, probably the biggest thing you can learn from Dutch design is just the sheer density. Holland is a very small country. It's got 15 million people. It's got big, sprawling cities, and how density is dealt with is something that we can certainly learn here.
The images we're looking at there is pretty much low-rise density. Has that been the trend, or do you have high-rise as well?
There is some high-rise in Holland, but most of Dutch density is done with low-rise solutions. And I think that's a huge challenge in Australia, that we're kind of caught between high-rise city centres and sprawling low-rise suburbs. It's the kind of stuff in between I think is really interesting, both architecturally and from an urban design point of view.
They are staggering figures when you put them in those terms. We all know how small Holland is, and you're talking about 15 million people, and everyone, I assume, to lesser or greater degrees, living and rubbing along together quite well. The argument you always hear here is about backyard space and open space. How do the Dutch resolve that one?
Dutch have very good park systems, and private space is actually private space. And I think the overall solution to that is just through good design. Dutch houses are generally very well designed. Dutch streets, parks and places, so it's not just a house, it's not just a building, it's the entire neighbourhood. And in Holland they talk about urban design, and where it's not just architecture. And I think there's a bit of a problem here in Australia where most architects are actually concerned about one house. And I think it's more about the street, I think it's more about the neighbourhood, I think it's more about the place.
And that's what I was going to ask you. When you, as an architect, when you're designing, do you focus on the building or do you focus on the street? What comes first?
Look, most architects that I work with are actually urbanists, and they're actually really concerned about the urban condition. It's how buildings touch the street. It's how the street works that's actually really interesting. How the building looks, well, that's kind of interesting, but it's what happens down at the street, which is kind of what actually makes a city really special.
I think you've really touched on the big issue, and we've mentioned it many times on this program, which is placemaking. And it is a huge trend, as you say, overseas, in Europe in particular, where they really understand, and in Canada I have to say, where you have to take in a whole series of issues in order to make a place where people are happy to live, work, come and go, travel through. We seem to have entirely abandoned that conversation here.
Yeah, in many ways we've actually tried to make it simple by making it just a straight development paradigm. But you're quite right, Virginia, it's incredibly complex, and I actually think the more people that get involved in the process, the better the outcome comes. Just people that think differently, and it's not just an architectural problem, it's not just a development issue. I think it needs to have a wider range of society involved in what their cities are actually going to look like.
So in your expert opinion, what do you make of some of the high-rise developments we've seen, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, in order to address the housing affordability crisis here?
Well, yeah, I would say that a lot of the high-rise projects in Melbourne, some are very fine, and there's some very fine architects here. The biggest criticism I have is what they do to the street, especially up the actual Carlton end of town. You've got 3 or 4 high-rise buildings there that are high-rise buildings that actually sit on car park podiums, that sit on the street. They do nothing for the city. And I think they can be done in a lot better way and achieve the same density outcomes.
Koos, it's a really interesting conversation, and we wish the Design Week well, but nice to see you here on the couch. Thanks so much.
Thank you much.
Thanks for joining us.